Welcome to the Federalists and Anti-Federalists Study Guide. Once the Constitution was written, it had to go to the 13 states for their approval. People would then vote for or against making the Constitution the new law of the land. The Constitution used a principle called federalism. It's a system of government in which there is a strong central government, but some of the power is still shared between the states and the national government. So the states didn't feel like they'd lost all control. Two groups of belief about the Constitution developed during this time. You had the Federalists, who believed in a strong central government, and they wanted the Constitution to pass just as it was originally written. On the other hand, you had a group that was called the Anti-Federalists, anti meaning against, and they did not really want the Constitution, but if they had to accept it, then they wanted it to include a Bill of Rights, so that they knew that people's rights would be guaranteed and protected. The Federalists included people like lawyers and businessmen, usually those who were more educated and more wealthy. They supported taking some powers from the states and giving them to the national government, that federalism we talked about. They wanted to divide the powers among the different branches of government, the separation of powers. They wanted a single person to lead the executive branch. They believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They thought of it more as a guideline that could be kind of pulled elastically, the elastic clause, to pass any bills and laws necessary to run the country. They also wanted a national bank. They said that if we've given the powers to tax, then it only makes sense to infer that we should be able to build a bank to store those taxes in, that revenue in. And lastly, they wrote a group of essays called the Federalist Papers. This series of essays supported the Federalist viewpoints and encouraged people to approve the Constitution. It talked to them about separation of powers and about the checks and balances, and encouraged them to go ahead and accept and approve it. These essays were written by such men as James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Originally they were published individually in the newspaper, but later on they were published as a book of 85 essays. The Anti-Federalists included farmers, laborers, a few politicians. They wanted the states to keep the most important powers. They wanted the legislative branch to have more power than the executive branch, and they feared that a single person in charge of the executive branch might become a king or a tyrant or abuse their power. They also believed that if you're writing a constitution, it should be strictly interpreted. If it doesn't say you can do something, then you shouldn't be able to do it. They did not want a national bank because nowhere in the Constitution did it say that Congress had the power to create a national bank. They also wrote their own essays called the Anti-Federalist Papers, and was written by people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, in which they discussed their beliefs that the Constitution should not be passed unless it included a Bill of Rights. There were a lot of arguments, there was a lot of discussion, there was a lot of disagreement over the Constitution, and it basically came down to whether or not they would agree to include the Bill of Rights. Once that agreement was made, they were finally able to get all the states to ratify the Constitution. But the Anti-Federalists and Federalists continued to have their opposing philosophies and eventually became our first two political parties, something we'll discuss more in a later session. And there you have the Federalists and Anti-Federalists